All right, good afternoon. I'm Charles Krause. I'm the Deputy Director of the History and Public Policy Program here at the Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's session on the complex history and legacies of the atomic bombings of Japan in August 1945. As many of you know, the Wilson Center was chartered in 1968 by Congress as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. Today, we are the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue. The Wilson Center is an especially appropriate venue for today's panel discussion for a few reasons. One of which is that one of the editors of the book, The Age of Hiroshima, Dr. Michael Gordin, is a current fellow in residence here at the center, and the other editor, Dr. John Ikenberry, is a Wilson Center alumnus. So we are delighted to mark the publication of this important book by two members of the Wilson Center community. A second reason that the Wilson Center is an appropriate venue for today's event is that for the past 10 years, we have run what we call the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project, or NPIHP, an effort to promote research and scholarship on the history of the nuclear age, and to demonstrate the relevance of this history to areas of current public policy interest. And many of the issues and themes discussed in the book have been central to the work of the NPIHP for the last decade. So if you'd like to learn more about this project, I encourage you to log on to our website and stay up to date with our events and publications. I also strongly encourage you to log on to digitalarchive.org, a freely accessible database that contains thousands of primary source documents related to the history of proliferation and non-proliferation from archives in Russia, China, South Africa, and dozens of other countries. I'd like to thank the Wilson Center's Asia program for co-sponsoring today's event, and to acknowledge my colleagues in the History and Public Policy program, Kian Byrne, Peter Bierstecker, Emma O'Shea, Jihan Kim, and Yeso Lee for their hard work in making today's event possible. And I'd like to remind the members of the audience and the panel to please silence your cell phone at this time. So I will now turn the floor over to our moderator, Dr. Jessica Mathews, and the panelists for this much anticipated session on the Age of Hiroshima. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Let's see, is that on? Great pleasure to be here and to be with this distinguished panel. Today, many of you may already have seen the news, but it's a nice and increasingly rare bit of good news that the Senate approved by a 55-45 vote to replace our out-of-date authorization for the use of military force and to forbid war with Iran without congressional approval, which is both something of a surprise, but also I think very relevant to some of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to come back after the panelists have spoken, and but let me start just by turning us over to Michael Gordin, who's going to talk about the vision and scope of this enormous and I think extremely important volume. Just to add one more word of timeliness, we are approaching not just the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima, but possibly with the end of the New START Treaty a few days after the next president's inauguration, the end of a half a century of work on superpower arms control that engaged the smartest minds in the hardest work, both in the U.S. and in the Soviet Union for 50 years. And if President Trump is reelected, it will be all gone in January of next year, or early February. So that's another reason why the scholarship that has gone into this volume is of such enormous importance, that we understand more both what we know and what we don't know about the nuclear era. So with that, Michael.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all for coming. And special thanks to the Wilson Center and Chuck for helping make this possible. I'm supposed to talk a little bit about the origins of this book. Unfortunately, we do not have them outside, but you can see the flyer. Sorry about that. It's not our problem. It's not our fault, I can assure you. So what the origins of this book, the ideas behind this book were, it, like many good ideas that I have, it was actually John's, who approached me in late 2014 because I had written a book on the end of World War II and nuclear weapons to talk through some of the issues about nuclear weapons, both historically and as a phenomenon in IR, international relations. And the idea was that we would get together a bunch of panelists to come in with pre-circulated papers and talk through the state of the scholarship as it existed in 2015 to mark the 70th anniversary of the atomic bombings. I'm almost always going to just say Hiroshima. We are fully aware that Nagasaki was also a target at the end of the war, and it is reflected in the book. But for a variety of reasons we'll talk about, there's a specific reason to focus on Hiroshima. So we made a list of the people we wanted to bring from both the history world and the international relations world, and amazingly, almost all of them agreed to come in October of 2015, and we had a first workshop, and we thought this was an exciting workshop, but we really wanted to make it a landmark of where we are now and how we're thinking now about the role of nuclear weapons since 1945. We had a second conference in August of 2017 in Hiroshima, thanks to the generous hospitality of Governor Hidehiko Yuzaki of Hiroshima Prefecture, who encouraged us to attach it to the Hiroshima Roundtable, which is an important peace studies forum that he organizes annually. And I also wanted to thank Kiichi Fujiwara, without whom the international global features of this volume would not be the case. He was really a third member of the editorial collective throughout. For me, part of the goal in wanting to put together this book is to shift the conversation from what I remembered in 1995 for the 50th anniversary. I'm sure many of you remember the 50th anniversary in Washington, D.C. It was a rather controversial event. With the Smithsonian, the exhibit which featured the Enola Gay being canceled. The Enola Gay is now displayed, but it's displayed out by Dulles. And what ended up happening, I think, as a result of a highly politicized, especially partisan mobilization of what the memory of the atomic bombings are supposed to mean for principally Americans, and also the mobilization of certain segments of the Air Force veterans community, ended up narrowing down a conversation that in the 1980s was actually quite broad in scholarship to a really mid-90s quite narrow frame. And it's narrowed in time, place, and theme. In time, the conversation that one had 25 years ago was basically about the summer of 1945. If you wanted to talk about Hiroshima, if you wanted to talk about the atomic bomb, you wanted July and August 1945. That's really the only place to look. Likewise, with place, the only places to look were Japan and the United States. It was as though the atomic bomb is only relevant for those two countries. At the very least, in the summer of 1945, the British and the Soviets are part of that conversation too. And thematically, the attention in a lot of very good scholarship was how the bomb fits into the end game of World War II. That's very valuable scholarship. It's an important set of questions to ask, but they are primarily historical questions, not political science questions as well, and they are also quite narrow. And what we wanted to do was to expand and say there's a lot to be done if you globalize the conversation about the atomic bomb and look at the effects that both the Hiroshima bombing, but also the fact that nuclear weapons have been used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki have done to reshape the international order over a long period of time. So a long period of time, the whole globe, if we could do it. And also that there's a real benefit to having historically friendly, international relations theorists who are friendly to history and historians who are friendly to international relations getting together to have a conversation about what we should think about the atomic bomb and how the events of 75 years ago are still shaping our present. So that's the origins and the framework in general. I'll say much more later, I think.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here, to be back at the Wilson Center. I had a great year here many moons ago, and I remember even on this stage sometime later debating John Mearsheimer. So I have memories in this room, not just the Wilson Center, so it's very good to be back here. And Chuck and Rob Litvak and others have been so important to this center. Let me say a little bit about the themes of the volume. Our aim, as Michael has said, has been to broaden and multiply the points of vision or the angles of vision, looking at Hiroshima and its legacies, trying to break out of the U.S., Japan, and even the U.S.-Soviet dyadic kind of framing of the meaning of Hiroshima, trying to illuminate peoples and states across the globe as they came to understand the bomb and act in the shadow of Hiroshima. So we're looking for voices and perspectives in this volume that go beyond the traditional views. And so we look at and find voices from South America, from India, and from Europe. And in these chapters, you start to see in the book that as you move away from ground zero historically in time and space, Hiroshima becomes experienced in ways that are filtered through frameworks defined by race, by religion, by ideology, by region, by geopolitics, by position in the global hierarchy. So we have Matthias Spector's chapter, which is a chapter from Brazil and South America looking up, the global south, highlighting Brazil's experience. And it's an ambivalent one. It's one where Brazil sees both the upside, if you will, the promise of nuclear energy, dual-use technology in pursuit of state-led development. But of course, Hiroshima also simultaneously illuminates the vertical structures of the global system and Brazil's lower position in that. So that kind of conversation about Hiroshima is brought into the volume. Broadly speaking, I think there are three angles or themes that come through this volume. One is decisions and choices. We look at governments, individuals, groups, making decisions, making grand strategy, operating rapidly in different rapidly changing circumstances. Alex's wonderful chapter is in this one. FDR, Truman, Japanese officials, Soviet leaders. Then we move to movements and resistance dynamics, pulling back into the larger system, looking at how Hiroshima triggered political movements, global alignments, shifts in the geopolitical hierarchy. So we have several chapters by distinguished Japanese scholars looking at the Japanese peace movement and looking at how Japan thought about its role as victim and as, in some sense, inspiration for looking at new possibilities. Stories of activists, bureaucrats, political groups, and so forth. And then finally, in the third part of the volume, we have chapters that look at Hiroshima as a kind of broader phenomenon, as revolutions and transformations in thinking. So we look at the nuclear revolution, really, as much as Hiroshima, and how it reshaped intellectual frameworks, grand narratives of where the world is going, and normative debates about how do we control this technology. Nina Tannenwald's very nice piece at the very end of our volume on the nuclear taboo and where it stands today. So looking at this volume as a whole, I think you see two kinds of ways of thinking about Hiroshima as a legacy. One is as an event, as we've suggested, as concrete moments, chains of events, who did what and why, but also Hiroshima as a phenomenon, how people came to live with the bomb, manifest in political, intellectual, and cultural fallout, if you will, from the nuclear revolution. And then finally, I hope, have something to say about the future. Thankfully, no bombs have been dropped in this way since 1945, that August era. The volume tries to, in some sense, aggregate two messages about the future. One is that memory matters, so not forgetting Hiroshima is important. that reverberates in Nina Tannenwald's chapter about the taboo, about learning and memory and what we think about what is right and wrong and how we prevent these sorts of things. And then looking at the future, I think the volume also shows that the future is open, that we can learn and we can act, and it's never too late. And in some sense, it's this, shall we say, slightly wistful, optimistic note that we argue at the end of the introduction is the fundamental insight of the Age of Hiroshima. So that's an overview.
Alex, I think you were going to, well, all right.
It's however you.
I could go next. That's fine. Hi, I'm Alex Wellerstein. Looking at what time it is. Okay. So I'm one of the contributors to the authors of this book, to this volume, and I was at both of the workshops, and I'm a historian. And I thought I would first not tell you about my chapter in the book, even though it's really exciting. It's easily the most controversial and exciting, and perhaps I would argue important thing I've ever written. And I'm not going to tell you about it because it would take me roughly a half an hour to lay it out in a way that would sound at all compelling to you, but I'll just tease you. It's about Harry Truman, and it basically concludes that he may not have known that Hiroshima was a city. Okay. And you're like, wait, tell me more. I'm not going to. Read the book. Okay. Because it would take too long to lay out the evidence. There's a lot of evidence. But I will say, and I had a lot of fun working on this chapter, and I had a lot of fun at these conferences, and I will just say I work on nuclear history. My main work is on nuclear weapons and secrecy, and I deliberately did not work on anything related to Hiroshima or Nagasaki when I was in graduate school. And I avoided it for many years. And the reason was, I thought, what are the odds you're going to find anything new to say about this? What are the odds that you're not going to just be going over ground that's been gone over again and again? People have been going over this for, at the time, 70 years. Who has the audacity to think that they're going to find something new there? And so I actually deliberately kept away from it because I thought I've got nothing to say on that. I'll look at stuff on the periphery. And, like any great thing, it pulled me in. I started looking at some things and looking at others and teaching and writing about it and finding that the story still had more to be told. There is still more to be discovered. People have been asking some of the same questions for a long time, but you ask the question a little differently, you find something else. One of the people who inspired me and helped me with this is Michael Gordin over here. His book, 5 Days in August, is an example of what I call in my essay a sort of epistemic history. Instead of asking exactly what happened, you start asking what did people think about what happened? And can you locate that in time? And can you locate how that actually evolves in time? And I'm a historian of science, so this is very exciting to me. This is like right up my alley. But once you start doing that, you actually open up all sorts of new research venues, and you find that we assume so much about what people thought and understood about the atomic bomb, say, the targets that they plan to use it on. You start probing into what evidence is there for what their internal mental states are, which is a very difficult thing to get at as a historian since they're dead. And all you can do is read their mail and things like that. But then all sorts of other questions come up. So I will just say if there are any people who are interested in the history out there and who have looked into it at all, there's actually still a lot there as far as I'm concerned. The more I look into it, the more I find that there's new ways of reading it. And we're not talking about I don't want to, we're not talking about like total reevaluations of everything or putting some political agenda or anything like that. We're talking about basic, even factual information. Did Truman know that a bomb was going to be dropped 3 days after the first one? That's the kind of question I like. And the answer is probably no. But that's a very interesting thing to start asking about. Why do I still stick with Hiroshima even after this? I think that in America, I think what John is saying about the importance of the memory of Hiroshima is really important, but I think a lot of people have the wrong memories, even people who were participants in this sort of activity. And if you have the wrong memories, you end up with the wrong history. And if you have the wrong history, then you end up with the wrong lessons. And the more I've talked with people, and these can be students, these can be people out in the public, these can be wackos who email me. You're welcome to email me, even if you're a wacko. I'll read all emails, even from wackos. is that they don't just understand Hiroshima as a piece of the past. It isn't just a story of something that occurred. It's a template for thinking about war. It's a template for thinking about the end of war. It's a template for thinking about the role of America in the world. And the more and more I talk with people, the more I think, oh my God, everybody has the wrong lesson in this country about World War II. And basically that lesson is, we're the good guys. We won it. It was very clean. Everything was great. And it's just so much more murky than that. And the danger here, the danger of going with the non-murky is you can get really bad policy ideas from that. You can get really enthusiastic about basically ends justifying the means. You can get very enthusiastic about starting a war because we got a good way to end it real quick. You could even get enthusiastic, and there are voices who still believe this, about the use of nuclear weapons again. One just little example about different views of the past that I use when I teach all the time now that I've been to Hiroshima. This conference was at the Hiroshima Grand Prince Hotel, which is a international business hotel just outside the main part of Hiroshima. It's very bourgeois. It's very nice. It is not a radical site for historical revisionism or anything like this, right? And in their gift shop, you can get all sorts of amazing things. One of which I got, which I did attempt to do, but it turns out I have no skill at this, a cross-stitch pattern of the Hiroshima atomic bomb dome, right? Which is a very weird idea for Americans, right? Like, you just put that up there with other stuff on your wall, that building that got destroyed but is still there. But even weirder than that, I did buy 5 of these. They have a little pin that you can buy, and it's Hello Kitty visiting the atomic bomb dome. And I show this to my students, and I say, what is this about? And they go, ugh. And I say, what's that reaction? And they say, that is sick. And I say, why? And finally it comes out that to them, the atomic bomb dome means destruction. It means the killing of thousands, tens of thousands of people, 100,000 people, right? It's like Hello Kitty goes to Bergen-Belsen, right? Like, we would not find that attractive at all. That's not how the Japanese view it. We talked with many Japanese there. I talked to people in actually several cities. We stayed there for a little longer in the conference, my wife and I. The atomic bomb dome in Japan is a place that you visit as a child because it's a peace museum. The point of keeping it around is not to rub your nose in the horror of the atomic bomb. It's to tell you about the rebirth of the city and the commitment to never having it happen again. That's a really different framing. They actually had a sign in the lobby that said, Hiroshima, the city that was destroyed and was rebuilt. That's a really different way to think about Hiroshima than Americans. And I meet students all the time who say, well, can you still go to Hiroshima? It's a city of 1 million people. You can completely still go there. I took that as a really potent symbol of the ways in which the framing matters and the lessons you take from it matter, both politically and not. So anyway, I'm just going to end there and just say that I've become more and more interested in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in particular. So if anybody wants to ask about Nagasaki, I'm all ready for it. Both because there are, in fact, historical mysteries and historical puzzles to be solved after all these years, and because it's not really just about understanding it as a past event. It's actually about understanding it from the vantage point of the present as we move towards the future. Thank you.
Great. Toshi.
Thank you. Definitely, I'm interested in buying one of the Hello Kitties, I guess, next time I have a chance to visit Hiroshima. My name is Toshihiro Huger from Georgetown University. As a student of nuclear history, I was excited to learn about this project. Unfortunately, I could not really participate in the project as I was busy with finishing my own book about one of the fallouts from Hiroshima, the Age of Hiroshima, that is the global dispersion of radioactive fallout during the Cold War. I'd like to first thank Wilson Center for hosting this exciting event at the 75th anniversary of the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki atomic bombings. And also, I'd like to thank John and Michael for inviting me as a discussant here. I'm a typical historian, so I tend to digress so much. So to stay in time, I like to basically use my note, and then really more like offer one of the possible readings of this rich book that really allows the readers to read the book in any way that you may find useful or inspirational. So what I'm going to discuss today is basically just my own rather idiosyncratic reading of the book. So as you may know, you can guess, I'm Japanese, teaching in the United States. So let me start my discussion with a little anecdote about Japan. In the Japanese language, there are two different written scripts used to describe the word Hiroshima. One is kanji, or Chinese characters, and then its use is fairly straightforward, namely to describe Hiroshima as a Japanese city. However, the other writing system, katakana, is a curious choice, because this phonetic script is typically used to transcribe words imported from other languages. The use of katakana to describe Hiroshima has a fascinating story. In 1948, 3 years after the Hiroshima atomic bombing, Kiyoshi Tanimoto, a Christian minister in Hiroshima, reportedly coined the slogan, "No more Hiroshimas," in his public appeal, calling upon the world not to repeat the tragedy of the atomic bombing again. It was originally written in the English alphabet as a message intended for the foreign audience. However, when the slogan became popular around the world, Japanese intellectuals and activists re-imported the slogan and then transcribed it for the domestic audience as a universal idea. This brief history of Hiroshima in katakana captures a dialectic of the global and the local, and the universal and the particular, that continues to engender the multiple and the diverse meanings of Hiroshima to this day. At the time of the 50th anniversary of the atomic bombing in 1995, as John and Michael have said earlier, Hiroshima was defined in the sense expressed with kanji, that is, Hiroshima as a historical event that took place in a specific time and place. The orthodox and revisionist historians fiercely disagreed with one another, but both sides tightly focused on the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War as seen from the United States, Soviet Union, and Japan. The book, The Age of Hiroshima, published at the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings, is a timely scholarly intervention with this narrow interpretation of the legacy of Hiroshima. The editors, John and Michael, have made a valuable contribution to nuclear studies by assembling scholars from different disciplines, generations, and national origins, together exploring the complex and the multifaceted legacies of Hiroshima as an epoch-making global phenomenon that marked the beginning of the nuclear revolution that we live in today. A sense of Hiroshima captured in the katakana script. But what is the Age of Hiroshima, and then what is the nuclear revolution? In the concluding chapter of the book, Francis Gavin has lamented how little we know about the nuclear revolution even 75 years after Hiroshima, laid out methodological challenges, and made a powerful case for epistemological humility. But he may be too modest, I think. Taken together, the 17 chapters of the book have successfully revealed a simple but profound fact, in my view, about Hiroshima that has fundamentally defined the ways the nuclear revolution has unfolded in the last 75 years. It was that the United States, a world hegemon in the international order after World War II, dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Just like we cannot really understand the Hiroshima without understanding the history of Japanese aggression and imperialism, we should not also forget the fact that it was the United States that dropped the bomb. This means that we cannot fully comprehend the legacies of Hiroshima without understanding the role of the United States in shaping the global international political order. The first 3 chapters of the book have demonstrated that the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were a product of various forces that structured U.S. nuclear decision-making. Craig Campbell carefully deduced Franklin Roosevelt's famously enigmatic thinking about the atomic bomb from his post-war vision, showing that Roosevelt's earlier decision to exclude the Soviet Union from the Anglo-American Atomic Partnership strongly conditioned President Truman's approach to the atomic bomb after his death. Alex has identified, and I'm not going to spill the beans too much about great chapter, but Alex has identified another constraint on the US policymaking, that is epistemological constraint, which might have led Truman to truly believe that Hiroshima was a purely military target. Sean Malloy has offered what he calls a race-conscious reading of the atomic bomb decision, showing how the apparent lack of reference to vulgar racism in the archives belied the role of racial ideology in US foreign policy. A number of the chapters have also demonstrated how the US-led international order emerging out of World War II fundamentally determined the ways in which other countries understood the meanings of Hiroshima. David Holloway has shown that the Soviet nuclear strategy always sought to deny the United States a position of superiority, first through the nuclear arms race and then through nuclear arms control. Takuya Sasaki and Wakana Mukai have both observed that Japan never really had the option to become an independent nuclear power after World War II, as the US-Japan alliance and the deep sense of pacifism doubly constrained the Japanese political elites. Avery Goldstein has explained how China, as the first non-European developing nuclear weapon state, in many ways defied the conventional wisdom that we had about the nuclear revolution based on the experience of the global north. In their respective chapters on India and South America, Srinas Raghavan and Mathews Spector have both pointed out that developing countries in the global south also viewed Hiroshima through the lens of neocolonialism, denouncing the nuclear destruction while pursuing atomic energy as a way to achieve economic development and national independence in a world of nuclear apartheid. The book has also revealed how Hiroshima and the role of the United States in it significantly shaped the dynamics of regional geopolitics after World War II. While the existing literature tends to emphasize competition among regional powers in the atomic quest, many chapters have illustrated a surprising development in which regional actors were also drawn together in opposition to US conceptions of nuclear order. Shinsuke Tomotsugu has shown how Japan tried to find a leadership role in Asia through technical assistance for the civilian use of atomic energy. Raghavan and Spector have both cautioned us against a teleological view of regional nuclear rivalry in South Asia and South America, underlining how the political leaders in India, Brazil, and Argentina sought to challenge the logic of nuclear power politics by pursuing alternatives, such as non-alignment and then the idea of a nuclear weapons-free zone. The book has also demonstrated that these national and regional reactions to the nuclear revolution had a significant global dimension, as government officials, scientists, and activists constantly exchanged concepts, symbols, materials, and knowledge across borders. As Holloway has noted, even the Soviet Union has part of this emerging global nuclear network, as some military officials and defense intellectuals freely borrowed the concept of assured destruction from the United States in arguing for arms control. Sonia Schmidt has also shown how the production of knowledge about the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki through the joint US-Japan Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission reflected and reinforced the founding idea of international nuclear order based on the separation of the military and the civilian atoms. The global power hierarchy after World War II, with the United States at the top, has also shaped the ways in which nations reimagined themselves in the shadow of Hiroshima. Holger Nering and Kiichi Fujiwara have both showed how citizens in West Germany and Japan living under the U.S. nuclear umbrella during the Cold War interpreted Hiroshima in such ways to portray themselves as the victims of World War II and the victims of the future war. And by doing so, erasing the country's role as aggressor during World War II and the U.S. partner during the Cold War. In the Third World, anti-colonial nationalism also came to be redefined in relation to the U.S.-led nuclear order, as Tomotsugu has shown in his study of the Bandung Conference in 1955. So how does all of these insights from the book mean for nuclear studies? Based on my own rather idiosyncratic reading of the book, and at the risk of sounding brazenly US-centric, I believe that we must continuously interrogate the legacies of Hiroshima and the implications of the nuclear revolution in the context of US hegemony and its transformation after World War II. This is especially important as we look forward into the future, standing at the crossroads in the US-led post-war international order. We must be sensitive to power inequality and its dynamics in international relations, and ask how Hiroshima catalyzed the creation of the nuclear apartheid that has reflected and perpetuated the privileged positions of a handful of states in the international system. While the nuclear-armed countries have consistently failed to keep their end of the global non-proliferation deal, the United States has repeatedly used or threatened to use military force to unilaterally disarm hostile countries suspected to have clandestine nuclear weapons program, often with disastrous outcomes for both the United States and the world, as Jessica has mentioned. Perhaps it is time, paradoxically, to revisit Hiroshima not only as a global phenomenon explored in this book, but also as a lived experience of the atomic carnage that warns us all about the peril of living with nuclear weapons. Finally, this makes me wonder about the future relationship between Hiroshima as an event and Hiroshima as a phenomenon beyond the 25th anniversary. Today, less than 150,000 atomic bomb survivors live in Japan, and even fewer around the world. As John and Michael have observed in the introduction of the book, the meanings of Hiroshima multiply and diversify as the mushroom cloud recedes further into the past. But what will Hiroshima mean after all survivors are gone? Even if the iconography of Hiroshima becomes even more detailed and colorful, maybe thanks to digital technology, is it going to get hollowed out at the core, with the void to be filled in with what one of the book's contributors, Shampa Biswas, has called metrocentric perspective, a view which takes a parochial or particular experience and presents it as universal. It is especially disturbing, as Fujiwara has pointed out in the book, the Hiroshima discourse in Japan is now facing many competing narratives of victimhood. The memory war is not by no means confined to Japan. Today, right-wing populism and historical revisionism are sweeping many parts of the world. Meanwhile, as Nina Tannenwald has perceptibly noted in her chapter, the nuclear taboo, still robust, has come under a new set of challenges, not least due to a recent reversal in U.S. nuclear weapons policy. How can we make sure that there will be no more Hiroshimas after Hiroshima ceased to be a lived experience? I think the book, Age of Hiroshima, will stimulate a thoughtful conversation among its readers about the future of the nuclear revolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Toshi. So we had to start a little bit late because of the backup downstairs, so I'm going to take a little 10 minutes extra at the end beyond our formal stopping time. We're going to have a conversation up here for part of this time, and then try to save a half an hour for all of you to shape our further talk. I've worked on nuclear proliferation issues for I'm embarrassed to say, 45 years. And my initial reaction to this book was amazement at how much I don't know. And as I think, so you all should feel very good about that. But I think it was John who said we assume so much. Was it you or one of the two of you? And a lot of what we assume is, in fact, not so clear. So I'd like to start this conversation by asking you what you learned that surprised you most.
I'm happy to start, I suppose. And this is triggered also by Toshi's comments and what Alex said, is one of the things that most strikes me hearing about other people reading the book now is the importance of absence of evidence throughout the book. So we do have, as Alex has said, a lot of evidence. We also have not nearly enough. So if you want to look at how many documents actually discuss the use of the bomb before August 6, 1945, you're looking at 100 pages, maybe, probably less. It's just a lot of stuff's not written down. And so what's interesting about many of the people in the volume, this is what I really learned, is how much you can get out of those silences. So Campbell Craig gives a very plausible reading of FDR's attitude towards the bomb. FDR basically said and wrote nothing about this object. But you can determine what he was thinking by trying to triangulate from the very few things he did say that were adjacent. Holger Nering has an excellent discussion about how mobilizing in West Germany against nuclear weapons is a way of talking about the fire bombings of Germany in World War II, which you aren't allowed to talk about. So that there's absences of evidence that if you read them carefully, more things show up. And the biggest absence, and this is highlighted in the third part of the volume, is we still have no really good idea why we haven't had nuclear war since. We have a lot of theories about why that's the case, but we have an N of 2 in terms of use of nuclear weapons in war to kill people. They've been used in other ways, testing, placement for deployment. There's all sorts of ways you can use a nuclear bomb without setting it off. But the question of the absence, how we can read that absence of evidence, just kind of haunts the whole book, because that's the goal, is not to have them used again. And we can't figure that out yet.
Back to that.
So that's where I would like
in
to
our next round. But John.
Well, yeah, there are lots of things I learned. I'm a generalist in international relations, and I do go every August to Hiroshima to the roundtable that the governor of the prefecture of Hiroshima hosts. And Gareth Evans and Scott Sagan from Stanford are there, and we try to use Hiroshima as a site for turning its history into a kind of platform for debate, for education, for activism, for bringing people together each year with reports, people who are elsewhere during the year, thinking about how to control and nuclear weapons, how to bring back the momentum that's kind of all gone away for arms control and disarmament. So I guess I've been learning and appreciating what I didn't fully appreciate, which is there is this kind of diffuse effort to blend the history and Hiroshima's legacy into social movements and to leverage and to remind and to have all of that feed into our politics and diplomacy. I learned the exquisitely complex way in which Japan thinks about Hiroshima and the broader role of the war as both aggressor and victim. The very nice piece by Kiichi Fujiwara in this volume, which I think is really quite brilliant, talks about the three ways that Japan talks about that past, the Hiroshima discourse or narrative, the Nanjing discourse, very different, and then Yasukuni. All three kind of ways of thinking about Japan's identity, its past, and how should it frame itself as a unique state that has such a complex history. and that identity politics as it kind of unfolded over the decades in Japan, for me, is just something I never fully appreciated. Finally, the kind of paradoxes and contradictions in the way we think about this legacy. I mentioned in my remarks that the Hiroshima had this kind of lightning effect, illuminating a landscape of international politics that was perceived by those that we now call those in the global south, the non-Western developing world. They felt this, they thought about it at Bandung, but it was more broadly a sense that this is yet another moment when we can see how weak we are and how peripheral we are and how much we are in the bottom of a hierarchy. In Brazil, India, our chapters talk about that in some detail. But also, so hierarchy, it's a nuclear apartheid, as Toshi suggested. But on the other hand, and this is what makes it a paradox, it was also in some sense the sheer fact that the logic of survival in this nuclear age involves keeping the weapons in the hands of the few and the powerful, with the idea that it's embedded in the NPT that this will not be something that will be shared. Those states will have obligations, but hierarchy becomes both the implication of the nuclear weapon, but also in some sense, our route towards survival, with a few states taking super responsibility. They're losing it today, but that special responsibility for trying to control these technologies. So those are three ways that I've kind of been thinking about what we've learned here at the 75th year.
Toshi, or I don't know if Alex, you. All right, Alex, you go ahead.
Reflection on the book.
Yeah, that's fine.
You can talk about your article for 2 minutes.
No, I'm not going to. It's very tempting, but it'd take more than two. And I don't want to do it. I agree with everything they said. But so what I wanted to say sort of was thinking about what did I learn from the whole experience of making this in particular, aside from all the talks and all that. And I will say the one thing I came away with from Japan, which was surprising to me, I went to Japan. Look, I was in college when 9/11 happened. I think of myself as having a very sort of early 2000s sort of mindset, in which, you know, sometimes you got to go to war, this kind of thing that was drilled into us at the time. And I always felt like I was a pretty realist about the use of force and things. I went to Japan and had a really lovely time. It wasn't just the museums. It wasn't that I didn't have sympathy for the Japanese people before I went, or the city or anything like that, but something about going into Hiroshima. We also went to Kyoto, which features very heavily in my article, and went actually to the really wonderful, very small, I gave a talk there, it's a Hiroshima Peace Museum. And, you know, normally I don't go to museums called peace museums because, like, in the United States, peace means, like, hippies or babies, right? Like, it generally has become coded with, like, naivete, right? And, my God, that was the best museum of war I have ever seen. It's called a peace museum, and it's about the horrors of war. And it doesn't pull any punches. It's critical of the Japanese, it's critical of the Americans, it's critical of everybody. And it's critical of its own university that it's located at for its role in World War II. It's extremely unsparing, harsh, depressing museum where nobody gets a free check. And getting between there and Kyoto and Tokyo, my wife and I, we took the Shinkansen, the bullet train.
I'm going to stop you.
Oh, let me just finish my last thing on the
very-
bullet train.
all
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I want to get through as much as we can.
Their trains are great. I took the Acela down here today. It's not great. And every time I take the Acela, I think about the Shinkansen. It's such a nice experience. But of course, I thought, well, how much money did this cost? The answer, about $1 trillion. And they started making it in the 1960s. And I kept thinking, the thought just can't get out of my head. They started building a bullet train when we started Vietnam. And I kept thinking, you make choices as a state. Anyway, I came back very much opposed to starting wars. So anyway.
Hey, Toshi.
It worked.
What was your biggest surprise that you learned from the volume?
Okay. Oh. Well, I think how fruitful it is to really bring together many different scholars. I think it is really we have, you know, Japanese historians, literary scholars, and then political scientists, and then history of science, and the sociologists of science. I think, as John and Michael have said, basically, really, our conversation about Hiroshima got really narrowed down at the 50th anniversary. So I think this is really refreshing way to really recover what we so much think that we kind of lost, in between, and also really showcasing some of the most exciting directions of the scholarly development.
So I'm the only non-scholar at this table, and I've worked in government and think tanks, and so I'm irretrievably focused on policy. And I think probably for most of us in this room, the importance of this subject beyond its historical value is shedding some light on future decisions that we face. And so I would love to hear whether any of you came out of this experience feeling that you knew more about this unanswerable question of whether deterrence works and will continue to work in the future.
I'll say two things about that. The first, which I should have mentioned earlier, is in between Conference 1 and Conference 2, the ban treaty was signed. So it was the summer of 2017 when many countries agreed to abolish nuclear weapons, not allow them to be based on their territory, etc. Something that the U.S. very strongly opposed and tried to get its allies not to do. And the only one that did was Netherlands because they were forced to by their electorate. But that shaped a lot of how I reacted to this, about the complicity that a lot of people have with the nuclear umbrella as it exists, and that pushing against that might help explain it. But the real thing that triggered this is Avery Goldstein's article here about China. To the extent that there's a nuclear revolution that happened, which is not just the bomb exists, it's a combination of the bomb and the missiles and the infrastructure, etc. It seems to me that China kind of got it right in that they have about 80 bombs. Like, that's all they need. They don't need 20,000. It's enough to stop them from being attacked. There's a kind of a way in which there's a restraint built into embracing some of this nuclear revolution that, I'm not saying whether they're correct about this or not, but it's clear that there's a philosophy of what can be done to stop the war, that different countries' nuclear postures can show us different ways of how to avoid this kind of thing from happening again, instead of assuming that the U.S. and the Soviet gargantuan make more and more of these is the only way to react to the existence of these weapons. And that might be a path towards non-use in the future.
Anybody else want to say?
I think for me, I mean, it's the great question. For me, this volume hasn't really helped me answer that question, except to say that that question of deterrence, does it work? Is that what has saved us all these years? What this volume shows us is that question is really embedded in lots of other global questions about norms of non-first use and never again, social movements that have put pressure on governments not to take the next step in nuclear development. And so I guess I can't answer your question, but the social milieu, the political milieu in which governments operate is so important, and that's why in some sense it's so frightening today, because remember the 80s? Remember when Reagan was deploying new missiles, intermediate missiles in Europe? There were millions of people in the streets in Europe and in the United States. I was at the University of Chicago, and where the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is published, and there was a huge group of scholars and experts who were active in this issue, debating it, and it seems like all that's gone. Nobody's in the streets. Nobody sees it as existential. I don't understand why that is, but I do know that when we did have that, it reinforced norms, it put pressure on governments, and it catalyzed critical thinking about how to keep stability amidst all this dangerous technology. And that global social setting has shifted, and I think that is something to worry about.
So how much of that is just the passing of time, the lived experience that people, not just the people who were bombed, but the people who had firsthand experience with how hard arms control is, are very nearly gone. And it is they who are speaking up most urgently about the disappearance of U.S. Russian arms control. Americans are never very good at one trial learning. I mean, not Americans, humans, at one trial learning, alas. Not as good as rats. And so I wonder, coming out of this experience, I mean, is the passage of time a terrible threat in this context?
I mean, it's striking. I'm sure you have this with your students. My students don't understand that there are nuclear weapons pointed at them right now. They think that happened in the 80s, and then it stopped when the Soviet Union went away, and it's not a pressing issue. Now there's a climate emergency that's different, and that as if the nuclear emergency is not still there. And so I don't know if it's the people retiring, stepping back, passing on that's producing it, or it's just that it was so linked to a particular geopolitical format that when the passing of that geopolitical format, it's assumed that those weapons aren't somehow still present and still incredibly dangerous. And that is, I don't know how to make that more visible to them. I sound like a crank when I talk about this with them.
I do think the generational passing of the arms control generation. Years and years ago, again in the 80s, there was a student movement, the student pugwash movement, and I went to the very first one. It was in San Diego, and all the first generation nuclear scientists and arms controllers that came out of that were there, and we were like the young people hearing their stories. They're all gone. That generation is all gone. The second generation is now getting very old, and so I do think that there is human capital, memory, and even the kind of trans-governmental epistemic linkages between scientific and arms control communities in what used to be the two superpowers is decaying. But the other thing that's changing, of course, is what made what you're describing earlier, Jessica, the 50 years of arms control, which maybe a year from now ultimately dying and will have ended by that point, was carried out between two states that saw themselves as peers, could by the 1970s engage in reciprocal sorts of gestures. Reciprocity is the most powerful diplomatic principle in world history, and there you had the two powerful states who could say, I will reduce this if you reduce that. And so there was a kind of symmetry of two states in a bipolar system. Now we have China. How does the U.S. and China do arms control when it's not, they're thinking about regional configurations. We've got to worry about that plus global. So it's harder to do reciprocity. There's extended deterrence that brings in allies. So I think the math is more difficult, quite frankly, as well as the generational change.
So let me just, before we turn to the audience, ask one other question. It picks up on something Toshi said near the end of his remarks, that we need to interrogate this set of issues in the context of perhaps the end of U.S. hegemony or the end of the U.S. shaped world order. Let me get your reactions to that. I mean, I without answering my own question, I do think we are at a moment where the post-war world order has run out of gas. It did pre-Trump. It's not a Trump thing, but he has smashed what is left of it. And so that means his successor is going to have to develop a new vision for the U.S. role in the world. which we haven't done in 70 years, 75 years. That's a big job, and people are just beginning, I think, to think about that. What does that say for this set of issues?
Well, that feels like a you question, John.
Well, I've already been speaking a lot, and that is one of those, I could speak for 2 minutes or for 2 hours. I mean, I'm not quite where you are, Jessica. I do think that there's one more run of American leadership. There's still gas in the tank if the right president, the right configuration, because I do think the underlying incentives are so powerful to remain in a world where you are tied to other countries through security cooperation, that you live in a system that's multilateral, not built around spheres of influence, that has a capacity, international capacity for collaborative work across political and economic domains. So I think it's still, the task today is the same as it's always been for the United States, and that is from all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, whose name is on this building, to make a world safe for democracy, to make our way of life secure, to create an environment in which we can thrive and be safe and protect our values and our institutions. So that hasn't changed. Trump hasn't erased that imperative. And to do that, you can't simply build walls. We can only be secure together. We can't be secure alone. It seems like the underlying, which is a motto that I would chisel on the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That is what Carnegie has been saying for all of your tenure and before. You can't do it alone. You have to do it together. And that includes and not only includes, it's a fortiori the case in questions of atomic weapons, where your security is infinitely tied to how other people will or will not do things to you. You can't put an iron dome over yourself. So I think we're compelled by events and circumstances of economic and security interdependence to revisit the international project. It may not be as hegemonically driven because we're not as powerful as we were, but gosh, if we aren't summoning our friends and looking for new friends to try to collectively build and rebuild structures of cooperation, then I don't know what we should be doing.
Okay.
So don't give up.
All right. We do have some microphones, so if you would wait for the mic, and then usually in these things, if you can, address one of the speakers with your question. If you can't, okay. There's a gentleman in the back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm curious about the question of the relationship between the atom bomb and NATO, because I've been trying to work on the origins of NATO, and I'm kind of intrigued by, at least among the Europeans, it doesn't seem to have come up as much as I thought it would have. It doesn't seem so much as a watershed. And some of the Americans, too, who are working with the Europeans in 46, 47, 48, seem to be almost referring more to the pre-war debates over collective security, what went wrong, the kind of debates in 36, 37, 38. So I'm just curious, particularly I guess this is for John, do you have a sense that, the move toward, because to me NATO is, in some ways the biggest huge change, right, in American history and global politics, in a sense, a huge national change on the part of the U.S. in this international alliance. So do you think the atom bomb really made a difference in, American willingness to do NATO?
That's a great question. I have a few thoughts about the origins of NATO, and it doesn't really go to the heart of the nuclear question. It has a lot to do with Germany and binding the rebuilding a Franco-German core to Europe, and keeping the Americans in and the Germans down and all the rest and the Russians out.
This is actually a question that I think, how many nuclear bombs do we have in 1948?
It's like 200 at most. No,
it's less. I think this is before Sandstone. This.
Yeah, well, it depends how you count it. Okay. 100 and something.
Yeah, but we don't have a lot.
Yeah.
So we're not building in terms of how European security is imagined, now the Europeans don't know how few bombs we have, but Truman eventually finds out how few bombs we have. In 1947, he kind of finds out. That does constrain what the importance of it. So I think it actually is a lot of the things John's talking about, the non-nuclear side, because there is a real constraint in terms of how profligate we can be about basing them.
Also, Truman is and this is a little bit in my article, but Truman is not that enthusiastic about using these bombs. He does not move them out of the country. He does not let the military have the bombs. So for all of that period before the Russians test the bomb is more, it's almost more of an idea than a reality in the American context. They have a few. In 47, they have like 0 assembled. I mean, that's how they have cores, but they don't have bombs. And I don't think Truman allows any bombs to be put into the hands of the military until 51. I mean, so the timeline on, we think of this as being the bomb from 45 on, but a lot of what we think of as being the bomb culture starts in like 50 or so. And this is in Michael's book also.
Yeah, this is.
I'm surprised you call 150 bombs few.
I actually think he's exaggerating the number.
It might be 150 cores, which is not the same thing as
the number in
bombs.
47 that I recall is 7.
That's assembled.
Assembled.
Assembled,
7
okay.
assembled bombs,
Right.
which
By
is
the end of it.
not a lot.
That's few.
That's few.
Okay. Yes.
I'm a freshman student from the Alice School of International Affairs, and I have a question for the Professor John Ikenberry. I mean, all of you panelists mentioned the international hierarchy for several times. So do you think the appearance and emergence of the nuclear weapon did really change the nature of the international anarchy to the hierarchy?
Anarchy or hierarchy? Which?
I think hierarchy. You said hierarchy, right?
I mean, do you think the emergence of a nuclear weapon changed the nature of the international anarchy to the hierarchy that you mentioned several times before?
No, I think it remained. It was both before and both after. It changed the nature of hierarchy, and it changed the nature of anarchy. I think in some ways, hierarchy, and as I was suggesting, some of our chapters in this book clearly suggest that it both illuminated and politicized certain features of hierarchy that were there that were then exposed to India, Brazil, and others who saw this as a reinforcement of the vertical character and their plight as weak and peripheral states. So in some sense, it did that. It certainly, as I suggested in my last remarks, it had this sense of centralizing and giving this notion of superpower status a kind of an extra sense of authority and importance. The superpowers were now stewards of human existence, so to speak. They had the power to destroy it. It was in their hands to prevent that destruction. That reinforced hierarchy of a certain sort. I think it also had a kind of paradoxical sense of putting them in a dyadic relationship that could then be used for reciprocal diplomacy. But it also changed anarchy in the sense, and this is this diffuse sense of Hiroshima as a phenomenon, the way in which we think about our planet and who we are and how we're related to each other, the nature of our interdependence. It was already changing before the bomb. In the 30s, I've just been spending the year at Oxford reading about the interwar period and the way in which FDR's generation were seeing time and space shrinking in ways, and you can't be secure because of the new technologies that make the oceans less of a protective barrier, and all that even before the atomic bomb. But the atomic bomb kind of makes that even more, turns that into an even more relevant insight of being connected and the tied to the good or the bad decisions made in other countries. So in that sense, anarchy looks more like a problem. The problems of anarchy are more intense, and so finding solutions become more imperative. So I think all these things are shifting, even as the basic notion that you have powerful weak states and you have anarchy remains constant.
Yes. In the back.
Hi, I'm Marianne Cusimano-Love from Catholic U. Two things. One, can you talk a bit about, you're all educators, you've all talked about what we assume we know about nuclear weapons versus what we do know. I find in educating about this at the university, it's very hard to enter into discussions with people because they're closed on this. They think they know a lot about this. And you bring in a lot of cognitive dissonance. So I wonder if you can talk about any communication strategies you have for piercing cognitive dissonance and entering in new data that is not comfortable for people. And then the second, on the point of the generational gap, is just for all of you here who have students, we are running this, it'll be our second year in a row this summer, Georgetown, Catholic U, and Notre Dame, a summer seminar on nuclear weapons to try to enhance the next generation's ability to undertake these issues. So please, we have applications now, send your students to us.
Can I just ask you to clarify before we turn to the panel? When you say they think they know and it's cognitive dissonance when talk about, is it they think the threat is finished over, this is a problem from the past, or is it?
There are several layers. Absolutely, what Michael said before, they think that the weapons are gone, the threat is past, so there's that. But then they also think, as was said before, that nuclear weapons kept us safe, deterrence has kept us safe, nuclear weapons ended the war. The reason the war was ended was because the United States dropped these atomic bombs, and therefore the Japanese backed down, and that saved lives. All that bucket of stuff, which is all extremely controversial, and there's lots of data on the other side of all of that. But they think those are all settled matters.
Okay.
Can
Go
I?
ahead, yes.
I do this constantly. This is like my half of what I spend my brain thinking about is how do you get through the knee-jerk, I think of them almost as programmed responses, because people have, you can go to people and say, should the atomic bomb be dropped? And you'll get like one of two responses in generally, but 90% of the time you get, we had to drop them to end World War II, and it's like a perfect statement. And you can sometimes say, where'd you get that from, right? Like, how did that get into your brain? You've never studied this. You've never read you don't know what you know nothing about the atomic bomb. Literally, there was a survey done around 2015 where they asked people how they felt about the use of the bomb, and then they asked them who developed the atomic bomb, and everybody had an opinion on whether the bomb should be used, but like only 20% of people under 40 could identify the United States as the creator of the bomb. And I'm like, okay. Let me just say I have a lot of little strategies, but let me just tell you the one that I use as a historian, which works well. I ask a class, what happened at the end of World War II? And just give me like the 5 events you can remember. And they say, Hitler, got it. Hitler dead, got it. Okay. Atomic bomb used, okay, great. End of war, great. And I say, okay, that's a narrative, and we call this the orthodox narrative. And I tell them this started in 1947, mostly. It was put in place by the people who used the bomb because there was a lot of criticism. And so they created this narrative. And then I say, let me give you another narrative. And I basically give them the Alperovitz sort of revisionist narrative about how the bomb is used to scare the Soviets, and we didn't need to use it to end the war, and the war wanted to end. And I ask, how many of you heard this? And usually you get like 1, 2 hands. They saw people's history of the United States or something like this, right? Fine, great. And then I say, this is another narrative. And we say that both of these narratives are based to some degree on evidence, but there's also a lot of interpretation, and there's a lot of historical stuff. And I say, I'll tell you that the historians I know, the practicing people who work on this actively today, most of them think the revisionist narrative is wrong. And then I say, and they also think the orthodox narrative is wrong. And the reality is some very much more complicated thing. And so my goal to get them is to both show them that the narrative they have is was not handed down from the sky, but has its own definite origin point along with the other one, and that historians actually debate these things quite actively, and I encourage them to get a little meta, and then I say, look, you don't have to believe one of these or the other, but let's look into it, and let's look into it with the knowledge that what we're coming to it with is probably not accurate, or to some whole degree. And this works okay on college students. It doesn't work so well on the general public. I have different strategies for that, but just putting that out there.
Could I add something to that?
Sure.
So I've done this to high school students as well as college students. The thing I usually focus on is the notion that there's a decision to drop the bomb which both the Orthodox and the revisionists assume there is. There isn't. And so I show them the order to drop the bomb. It's 2 pages long. It's a page and a half. And I have them read it, and we talk about it. And the president's name, the president doesn't sign it. The president's name is only mentioned in terms of PR. And what the bomb is what the order is an order to initiate atomic bombing. And here are some cities, and there's the equivalent of crunch all you want, we'll make more. There's like, we will make more bombs for you. And so it's not, it destabilized it, but it's a document from the Air Force Command. It's the Army Air Forces Command. It is the document that actually authorizes this, and getting them to see that there's a text that this thing is based on that's much closer than the narrative they have, I think reorients. They realize that it's not just making it up your narrative that suits your political position. We actually have evidence. The evidence is complicated, needs to be interpreted, but we have it. And confronting people with that, it's very easy to read. It's typewritten. It's very clear. Those kinds of touchstone documents, the Einstein letter, because he didn't write it, all of those things I find very helpful to destabilize it.
The movie 13 Days is also a good
Yes.
way to grab people. It's laid right there, and then we'll go here.
Hi.
Oh, sorry, gentlemen.
I think there's a threshold for how much contagion and catastrophe that humans can deal with on a individual level and on a societal level. And it seems to me that, a key thing that hasn't really been talked about in this seminar thus far about why there haven't been any atomic bombs exploded, quote, in anger in war since then, is because the world, ever since the end of World War II, has been engulfed in endless subatomic war and coups against democratically elected governments, endless struggles and strife, Afghanistan, etc., Crimea, etc., 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 there's no need to really drop any atomic bomb to have great, horrible tragedy and human disturbance. And, dealing with atomic issues as such doesn't address at all the endless wars that seems to characterize human society in this era. So
I actually think it does, in that once the atomic bomb is there as like, that's the threshold, that's going nuclear, like that's the thing that's way beyond the pale, you can do anything that's not that. And often what you can do that's not that is much more destructive. Like many more bombs are dropped in Vietnam than are dropped. And the most destructive bombing rate of World War II is Tokyo on March 8th, 9th. More than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It's a little bit less than combined, but it's... so once you have this sense that there's a threshold, I think it actually restructures how you think about the conventional and makes the conventional permissible, as long as you're not going above that. That's my take. So I don't think you can separate them off, because it gives permission for a lot of other things.
In international relations theory, we have a model for that. It's called the stability-instability paradox. And it's precisely what Michael said. When you sort of have stability at this nuclear level, it actually gives permissiveness for other kinds of uses of force below that level.
And I also wonder whether students, especially, or that generation, can only absorb one existential threat, and that's climate now. And maybe people, it's just too much, is to have two existential threats.
It's much faster. It'll only take 30 minutes if Putin has a bad day. Really.
Okay, please.
My name is Milton Leitenberg. I began working on nuclear weapons arms control in 1965. My two mentors were Bernie Feld and Leo Szilard. They both worked on the bomb. I disagree with what you said, and I want to go back to your question, why hasn't there been another use? There's another book that was just published, Fred Kaplan's second book, And there's Ellsberg's book of 2 years ago. I don't think social movements had much to do with anything, and I don't think Never Again did. It's been a bit of a miracle. None of you talked about things like the JSTPS and SAC and the failure of McNamara and Kennedy and all the arrest in Eindhoven and all the deputies and Carl Kazin to rein it in, and nobody else has been able to rein it in, and nobody else has changed the PSYOP and the war plans and all the rest. Though we've had a big drop in the numbers, yes, enormous drop in the numbers. I mean, all the stuff I wrote for SIPR, you can track all those numbers and the drops from 68 to 71. But the question is, how come it didn't happen? With all the alerts and all the DEFCONs, and the Russians had theirs, and there were accidents and interactions in the Mideast with American Soviet fleets. You have the Dulles Oral History Collection. I once read that at 71 at Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
Look at Arleigh Burke's.
Okay.
You will see that the librarian whited out one line, but if you hold it up, you can read the line. And Arleigh Burke says, the first Taiwan Straits crisis, I had more nuclear weapons on one carrier than all of the Soviet Union had. No, he says megatonnage.
Oh, yeah.
And he's correct. And he said, at that time, I had authority on my own to use those. And I was just waiting for China to shoot down one of our recon aircraft. So there's been 75 years, well, not 75, starting from 53 or so. There's been a large number, very large number of escapes and risky scrapes, and no one really has a sensible explanation for why it didn't happen.
I think the answer is that there's no answer. I mean, depending on how you look at the history and what your own gut tells you, it's either luck or, as you say, a miracle, or deterrence, or I don't know if anybody wants to say that, but
shave is different as well.
Yeah.
Hi, Milton. Sorry, I've ignored your emails. I just want to say I think you're totally right, and I'm glad you brought this up because I kind of wanted to bring it in. But one of the things I was thinking when you asked about deterrence was deterrence is in people's minds. And it's not a lot of people's minds. For most of the war, and even today, you're talking about a dozen minds in the world who are in charge of making that stay alive, because we've centralized nuclear weapons. Unlike a lot of other things our government does, nuclear weapons are centralized in basically one person in the American system. It's 3 people in the Russian system. But it's a little, and of course there's other people who have to follow the order. You can get in the question of would they defy the order. But you're not talking about a lot of minds no matter how you do it. You're talking about a very small number of people. And if they have the idea that using the weapon is a terrible idea, then it's enacted in the world. And if they don't have that idea, then we are in a dangerous, dangerous place. And this is what Nina Tannenwald's book is about. One of my favorite books on nuclear weapons is Nina's book on the nuclear taboo, because she goes through each and every one of these crises, and she looks at what are the factors that lead towards them not being used versus them being used. And sometimes they're incredibly idiosyncratic. It's, Truman just doesn't like them. So no weapons used in Korea. If it had been Eisenhower, probably would have used them in Korea. That's not a very rational reason, right? That's not inspiring. And especially the stuff in Ellsberg's book, when you get into this era of pre-delegation, where you're knocking that authority down. And Ellsberg, if you haven't read his book, it's very interesting. He says it goes down way lower than even the official admittance that it went down very far went. And I do sort of agree that I'm not saying deterrence doesn't exist. There are some people who say deterrence is a myth. It doesn't exist. I don't know. How would you measure if deterrence did exist? I don't go that far. But I will say I think that there's a lot of factors. And instead of saying, though, we can't know, I would say it seems, this is because I'm a historian, I'd say it seems incredibly contingent, which is really just a very intellectual way to say, well, it depends on what happens that day. And that's
And-
not
and-
reassuring.
Right, and very idiosyncratic. I mean,
Yeah.
anybody who's worked in government can tell you
Yeah.
that nothing important that happens bears any resemblance to formal models or social science theory. None. Yes. Okay, but I want to give that to the gentleman back there. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm Diane Perlman, George Mason School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. So, reflecting back on the glorious days of the 80s, I was one of the million people in Central Park. I started as a speaker for Physicians for Social Responsibility on psychology of the arms race and taught a course. And there was a very rich body of work at the time, also on deterrence theory, spiral theory, like Jervis and Ned Lebo, about under what conditions deterrence theory holds and under what dynamics it flips into spiral theory. And you talked about reciprocity, and we had GRIT, graduated reciprocated initiatives, intention reduction. So anyway, there was a lot of work done then, and I was also doing research on children's fear of nuclear war and all of that. And then in 2000, we had a conference on the second nuclear age in the Academy with Lifton, Shell, and all those people. But anyway, I've gone to all the NPTs that have been in New York since 2000. And I was also, and there's always a fight between the nuclear weapon states and all of civil society and the non-nuclear weapon states. And I was also at the ban treaty in 2017, and in November, the first conference on a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. And the U.S. and Israel boycotted that one. And the dynamics was completely different. It was very relaxing, and just to have that dynamics there and to be free of that. So anyway, the 2020 NPT is coming up in a few months. It's going to be like incredibly intense, I think, with all these things going on, and also just the role of vested interests and defense contractors and all that. So I just welcome any
So
comments.
you have a question?
Well, just comments
I
about
see.
that, or the NPT,
You
or
just sort of want to make us depressed even more so.
All right, well, we have a gentleman back here, and then I will try to do, we'll see if we can get, there are 3 more hands, and we'll see how many we can do.
My name is Nobuo Fukuda, a writer and former scholar at the Wilson Center. I have one question in mind, which I'd appreciate if I could invite comments from distinguished historians in the panel. I remember reading Leslie Groves, the Army general who was in charge of the Manhattan Project, assured Harry Truman that it would be quite unlikely for the Soviets to successfully develop their own nuclear weapons for another 5 decades, 50 years. I hope I'm not mistaken. And my question is, how important, how significant that information was to the president as, he was about to make his final decision. I mean, if I could invite some kind of factual comments. I mean, had the president been given more accurate projection of the Soviet situation, I mean, would he have had the second thoughts on the use of nuclear weapons against Japan, or he would have gone for the bombing anyway?
Let me hold that in your mind. Let me take these last 3 questions, and then we'll go through and try to answer all of them. Gentleman there.
Howard Moreland. I back in the 1980s, I used to go around the country sort of posing a question similar to the one of why are we in Vietnam? It's why do we have an arsenal? And deterrence and that stuff is, to me, just sort of metaphysics and theology. But the actual weapons that we have, every weapon is designed for a mission, and it's connected to a delivery system and to a part of the military structure which will accomplish this mission. And so my question was, what mission with nuclear weapons will actually improve a situation? Just describe any situation and then figure out what kind of military mission using nuclear weapons will improve that situation. And if you can't answer that, then it's the same as the question of why are we in Vietnam? It's because we shouldn't be there.
It's a really good question. Somebody's got that in ranking notes. Yes.
Richard Coleman, CBP, retired. It seems like a couple years ago, a very obscure obituary was about a Russian technician who decided not to respond when he saw blips coming from the West. And when I read that, I said, this guy saved the planet. And he's, B14 in the newspaper. Why was there no celebration of this guy? Was it just because he was a Russian we couldn't acknowledge that? And of course, the greatest truth of all time is, gentlemen, no fighting in the war room.
Yes, and of course there was also the case that happened on the U.S. side too.
Yeah.
And in Bill Perry's book, you have a spine-chilling story of that, where somebody put in a training tape instead of what the technician thought was real-time attack. Last question. Gentleman right here, did you have a question? No. All right. All right, go ahead, one more.
Sorry, Erin Gallagher with the Council on Foreign Relations. I was actually, so we talked about historical memory and kind of navigating how maybe we're not getting the right lessons. And you kind of touched upon it when you discussed the Enola Gay exhibit. But I found that with a lot of, especially, people who might have had family in the military, you talk to a lot of people who seem to tie this idea of, oh, well, we had to drop the bomb with this idea of, national pride, in the sense of, well, if America really didn't do the right thing, and not even thinking about how the occupational forces really suppressed the voices of the victims at the time, that there's this kind of sense that if we didn't do the right thing, then we can't be proud of America as it is now. And I'm wondering, when you're trying to redefine the narrative in this way or kind of muddy the waters, how do you deal with this, I guess, more emotional response when you're trying to discuss it rationally? I think there's a disconnect there that I found it difficult to breach.
Okay. Toshi, why don't we start with you and let's just all four of you do your best with those four very different, challenging questions.
Sorry, let me see. Okay, maybe I'm gonna answer. I'm gonna try to answer
the last question.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I was not quite prepared because
Okay.
I'm not really part of the the project itself. I think it's about really if we can think about ourselves as an independent thinking citizen, as opposed to like completely identifying ourselves completely with the state or nation, right? It's really about civicness, right? So I think I think one way, of course, is to just Alex described earlier, like really show two different point of views, and then show that actually neither of them is really right. Quite true. And then I think it's important to make them curious, so that they start asking questions and they start like exploring themselves. I think that's kind of one step toward really, questioning or assumptions made about this.
Alex.
I'll just say on the last part, I call that Grandpa wasn't a war criminal, and that's my name for the response. And how do you deal with that? With compassion, right? It doesn't matter what they're not hearing what you say in that situation. They're actually telling you some other story at the same time. And so what I usually never set up is it's never for me, you have to believe the United States was bad, or you have to believe the bombs shouldn't have been dropped. I think that's complicated, right? And I acknowledge that. But I do say, at some point, we have to grow up and see America is a state and has a complicated history like all states and has many really great things for it. That doesn't mean that you can't actually interrogate its past actions and understand them in the light of what they needed to be at the time. and what they were at the time, but we can also decide what we want to do going forward as well. So that's sort of how I engage with people on that. And I never tell them Grandpa was a war criminal or anything like that, right? The other thing, I'll let Michael's going to talk about Groves and Truman.
I'll do that.
Yeah, great. And I don't know who's going to answer Howard's question. Hello, Howard. But I will say on Stanislav Petrov, I mean, he's become better known. There's a documentary called The Man Who Saved the World. There's books. David Hoffman's The Dead Hand is a very good description of the Petrov incident. And I will just say amongst historians, there's actually some question about, did he save the world? Is it as big as it's made out to be? And part of me doesn't really care, because I'm like, look, it's a good symbol no matter what. And if you're going to take a memory out of something, that's fine for me. But I like to put it in the context of broader close calls, and should you have a system where any time should it come down to one person, which gets back to my earlier thing about command structures. I distrust all human beings, sorry guys. And any one person is immensely fallible in either direction. And I'm not saying we should let AI do it, but I'm just saying, this is why multiple people are probably better. Anyway.
Before I turn to you, and then I just want to share a personal experience. The Carnegie Endowment had an office in Moscow, which I visited regularly, and I was there one time in the middle of the winter during the time when the Russian economy nobody was getting paid, and we went out to dinner, and I was the only person in the taxi among the 5 of us who didn't speak Russian. But I could hear this conversation with the taxi driver, and I could hear the tone in the taxi. Really? That kind of a tone, and then this sort of urgent back and forth. And when we got to the hotel, I said, what was that all about? He was a colonel in the rocket forces, hadn't been paid in 4 months. He was in command of a missile silo about 100 kilometers outside of Moscow. And he was driving a taxi in order to make some money because he hadn't been paid. And so my colleague said, well, who's in command of the missile silo? And 2 privates. And it was chilling. It was really, it was chilling.
There is a 1990s post-Soviet Norway-related very close call. So it's not just Petrov. This is just intrinsic. Like Howard Moreland's basically right. Like there is no good answer to the question about the Soviet time to proliferation. So there's 2 parts of that question there. One is the nature of what information Truman gets. Truman is given estimates that range from 6 months to 5 years to 10 years to never, and Groves is pretty close to never. He gets all of that from very reputable people. That just different people say different things. The CIA says 5 to 10 years every year. So just on year 5, it actually works. So he gets information like that. We had no human intelligence. We had basically no signals intelligence. We had no way of estimating. The Americans had no way of estimating what the Soviet path to the bomb actually was. So he couldn't have gotten better information. But that's a point about Soviet proliferation. Your main question was about Truman making the decision. Truman didn't make a decision. The decision to drop the bomb was made about 3 or 4 years before Truman became president. Like, once that project gets going, it gets going. The only thing that could stop it is the war ending sooner. There's so much momentum built into that happening. Truman never signs the order. He's told there's going to be an order to drop the bomb, but he doesn't know where it's going to land, and he doesn't know there's going to be a second one. So anything he would have been told about the Soviets wouldn't have affected the decision stream, because Truman is mostly outside of that decision stream as it happens, because he's boxed in by many things that other people have done before. So that's my take on this decision making. You and I think, mostly agree on.
I have some quibbles, but I would say for a really good book on this, Michael Gordon's Red Cloud at Dawn is all about exactly this question, and it is the reference book. You should read it. It's fun to read.
Yeah.
You're up.
Oh, I'm up. So I'll wrap things up here. I think what you've heard has really reinforced my view that a book that brings international relations scholars and historians together is constructive and catalytic. And thank goodness we had historians on the panel today who could give you a sense of what the documents say. And I think you have to both look at this problem of the Age of Hiroshima from that angle, but also from our larger focus on forces of anarchy and hierarchy and how political systems deal with technological revolutions. So I think that reaffirmed something that we tried to explore in this book, and I hope we do more of this sort of thing in the future. Thank you for the Dr. Strangelove reference. That movie is now showing on United Airlines flights to Europe, so it's back. So, you know, don't fight. You're in the war room. You know, that will always be a great moment. Finally, this kind of from the Council on Foreign Relations person. The American narrative of Hiroshima is very, very interesting. I will just end with a personal anecdote. I went to Hiroshima with my 10-year-old son some 10 years ago now. He's now a freshman in college. But it was a major moment for him. The museum, I agree with Alex, it's extraordinary. And he said he's going to take his son someday to that museum. In December, he went to Pearl Harbor and took a tour around to the Arizona. I was there with my wife and son, and Kurt Campbell was in town, and he invited us to go with him on the presidential barge because it was a trial run because the next day Obama was going to go out. So my son, who had been in August in Hiroshima, was in Pearl Harbor in December. And all I can say is the juxtaposition was confusing, and 10 years later, he's still trying to figure it out. But I think that's healthy and trying to throw different narratives and different points of view at you, and it's the complexity is there. You can't escape it, and it forces us all to continue to ask these questions and rethink this extraordinary moment in world history, even all these 75 years later. I hope we have made the case, and it seems like you have made the case, that it's worth remembering and asking these basic questions over and over again.
Do you want to say, before we close, anything on this tough question about missions and weapons, the nuclear weapons?
I don't see a utility for a nuclear attack, but there are other people who do. Those people tend to be much closer to actually being able to order that than I am. So unfortunately, I think you're right about the question. I think if it's posed that way, it's hard to answer. There are people who will say, "Here's a mission where you really need one, where you have to decapitate all of the Bond villains are in the same room," and but it gets to be fantastical very quickly when you start putting it that way. So I basically agree with your stance.
And can I just piggyback and just say what disturbs me actually, Howard, is that you can find people who have very elaborate, very rational reasons. The rationality as itself can be very seductive if you're willing to go down certain paths. And to me, that's all the more reason to be disturbed by them. So.
Well, and we're about to spend $1 trillion upgrading our nuclear arsenal, so it's
not getting a bullet
it's worth thinking hard about. I want to hope that all of you will join me in thanking this panel, and in particular thanking Michael and John for this project. I urge you, when you can, to buy this book because it really is a terrific read, and everybody will learn from it. So thank you very much, and thank all of you.
Thank you.